But democracy without ethics ceases to be democracy. It becomes autocracy. And this is why I am trying to introduce this idea, which Rajiv has done so successfully in the book, but I hope one does it more successfully in terms of convincing people of the centrality of ethics to a society. The year 1947 was not just a historical marker, which it was. It was a marker recording a dramatic and a traumatic change, both together. It marked a major shift in our history, establishing a new formation of governance. Its core was to be democratic functioning, unfamiliar to us from pre-colonial or colonial times. This was something brand new that we were going in for. But it had a little visibility, a small, tiny visibility in the discussions that went on as part of the national movement, the anti-colonial movement. And so there is a linkage there. The earlier centralized kingdoms and feudal states, if you like, were to mutate into a democratic nation state after we became independent. And from being subjects, from being the praja, or the children of kings, we were to become free citizens in a nation state. And we were to establish all the rights of citizens as required by our Constitution. And I couldn't agree more with what has been said about the centrality of the Constitution in the society that we're making today. And democracy, if it is to be effective, also requires, in addition, ethical governance. That is a must. In early times, clan societies took form gradually as kingdoms and centralized systems, and these systems changed to more feudalistic patterns or similar patterns of governance. The next change lay in the overthrowing of colonial rule and its being replaced by something totally different, a secular, democratic nation state. And please remember that what we were doing was not just automatically gliding from one thing into the next. We were doing something absolutely new, and therefore we should have had our antennae out, which unfortunately we didn't have. In the first decade, some sights were set towards freedom and equality in accordance with the Constitution. All citizens claimed equal rights without any historical or social differentiation. In theory, this was granted. This was contradicting, of course, the traditional texts, the Dharma-shastras, the Hadith, and so on. They don't believe in the equality of everybody. They believe in the inequality, and therefore it's important to keep that in mind. The collective rights in the Constitution were also intended to ensure the material welfare of all citizens. And we often forget that. We're so busy talking about liberty, equality, and fraternity that we forget that the collective rights also mean food, water, education, health, social justice, and so on. That is extremely important. And the most important of these is, of course, the freedom in all spheres, religious, political, social. Now, India begins life as the child of democracy, and I'm very particular that it is not parental, it is a child. It is a child of democracy, and so too were all its other siblings. And by siblings, I mean all the other colonies that were given independence at this time, that moved from a colonial system to hoping to become, independent nation states. And they were all looking forward to being liberated from colonial control and born in freedom. So the well-being of the growing child of democracy lay in providing the rights of citizenship, and the ethics of governance should have been the model. What happened? Partition, in a sense, drew attention away from the rights of citizenship and focused on communalism. What we should have been celebrating and working towards was the creation of this democratic nation state, instead of which we were rightly or wrongly and very understandably upset by what had happened, and therefore communalism became a very important feature of our existence. That which should have ended with the coming of the nation state. Right, you've got your two nation states, you've got an Islamic state in Pakistan. That should have been the end of the story, of that story. But on the contrary, it was reinforced by religion-based nationalism. This nationalism that came up in the 20s and 30s, which was really drawing from religion. It was not anti-colonial. It was banging and attacking the other religion. It became a diversion. It became a diversion from the action of moving towards a secular democratic nation state. And questioning its feasibility for a secular democracy was not adequately argued. And this is where my generation, I'm afraid, failed. We should have been much more conscious of the need to argue this. And if we are to quote antecedents from the past, then the freedom and necessity of arguments, what he calls conversations, discussions, debates, go back many centuries to the time of the Buddha, even earlier. Cities in those days had parks for such forceful debates and considerations among citizens, and they were very appropriately called the Kotuhalashala, the place where you raise curiosity and you ask questions, awkward questions, and you have discussions. And I often think that maybe we should go back to revising that, having Kotuhalashalas, not just one in one city, but all over. Which is why I'm in full agreement with what was said earlier about the need for samvad, the need for argument, the need for discussion. But there's one difference. The Kotuhalashala is not dependent on some organization getting together and putting up a big banner and saying, come and discuss this in the precincts of this, this, and this. These are natural occasions where people gather in parks and crossroads and talk. I mean, we don't have pubs, but if we had pubs, then the pubs would be our Kotuhalashalas. But I think it is very, very important as part of civic life to have places where people can just gather and gas and talk to each other, maybe learn something, maybe not learn something, but get it out of the system. Talk about what's worrying them and disturbing them and what needs to be done. And such spaces, of course, were very characteristic of early cultures. And so there's something to be said about taking early cultures a little more seriously and perhaps looking at how they organized civic life. The Greeks in Athens, for example, had what they called the groves of academy. And we all know that people like Plato and Socrates spent many hours in the groves of academy discussing their ideas and formulating them. Socrates, alas, had to drink poison because he did not believe in the gods that were being promoted by those in power in Athens, and therefore had to be silenced. But it's not necessarily that every Kotuhalashala should end up with people being silenced. In fact, the purpose is to get them to talk. So that's why you discuss things like the rights of citizens, and the equality of citizens, and all these very basic issues which we are vague about. I mean, how many of us have even read the Constitution that we swear by and keep on saying we must have the Constitution? Anyway, I would like to highlight one significant argument from Rajiv's book that I thought was particularly pertinent to our times, the subject of ethics and its relationship to politics and governance. That is really absolutely essential that we give thought to this. Why has democracy not become the established norm in the last 75 years? Time enough for there to be some roots somewhere. We seem to be unclear on the subject of ethics and governance. For instance, in the very first decade, we had adult franchise. This was Nehru's great achievement, and democratic representation through regular elections. What do we have today? We have defections. They have a bearing on the elections. They're not unconnected with elections, but they are defections. And the question that we have to ask is, are defections compatible with the implicit ethics of a democratic society and system? If they are not, please let's get together in a Kautuhalshala and discuss this issue and understand why we think that they are not and why they seem to be acceptable. In place after place you have this happening without too much of a fuss being made. People sort of seem to think, ठीक है वो election हो रही तो defection भी साथ में चल रही है. But this is something that one has to really... and the same question can be put to majoritarian politics, that the majoritarian politics that annul the idea of equality of all citizens. Democracy surely is something more than just a numbers game. And this is where, again, discussion is important. Speaking of ethics in governance, and please forgive me, I'm going back to one of my favorite topics. Speaking of ethics in governance, one ruler who raised this issue centuries ago was, of course, Ashok Maurya. He gave it much attention, and to which, in fact, Rajiv has referred fairly frequently, as has been mentioned, and I was delighted to see those references. Ashoka is about the only ruler who left us a large body of his own thought on this subject, particularly of ethics. And the much quoted comment of H.G. Wells that he was a unique ruler amongst world rulers was occasioned largely by the king's declaration that the Dhamma, this is his interpretation of the Dhamma, do not confuse it with the Buddhist Dhamma or the Brahmanical Dharma. This is an Ashokan concept which he discusses in his edicts. I've tried my best to explain that there is a difference between his Dhamma and the Buddhist Dhamma and the Brahmanical Dharma. But it is that being essential to civil life which is really extremely important. He informed us that 8 years after he began to rule, he fought a fierce campaign in Kalinga. The aftermath of this left him in deep remorse. He saw the severe disturbance that it had caused and the violent killing of many thousands of people. But curiously, he did not do much about it initially. And I've often wondered why it took him a little over 2 years, more than 2 years, to begin to think seriously about these problems. If it was such a traumatic experience, he should have thought about it immediately. It was only a few years later that he spoke of recognizing that the ethic of good governance lay in ensuring the well-being of people over whom he ruled. And after his 12th year, he became even more active in this matter and expounded on it much more fully towards the end of his reign in his 27th year. The acts, intentions, aspirations that suffused his thought were what he referred to as Dhamma. He spoke separately of Buddhism to the Sangha, but his understanding of what he called Dhamma as an ethic for society was in a different voice. And that's the important point, to recognize that different voice. He made a distinction between the ethics of the teachings of a particular sect, as applied to its followers, and the ethics of the more extensive kind, applicable to all his subjects, irrespective of whose teachings they were following. And the public is enjoined to observe the ethic, to accept that all the diverse teachings of the time should be respected. Concord, he writes, is to be commended, so that men may hear each other's principles. This is an important point. His solution does not lie in lynching, beating, burning, slaughtering those who are even suspected of having other kinds of different beliefs. Above all else, the unique thrust in his practice of governance, what he comes to gradually in time, but eventually reaches there and becomes a great proponent of it, is the ethical preeminence and practice of non-violence, ahimsa. This for him was the crowning practice, but he comes to it gradually. He doesn't rush into it. Apart from respecting elders, parents, teachers, and many other laudable activities as part of the ethic, there is also the more all-pervading ethic. All his subjects must be aware of the need for their well-being, as also the responsibility of those ruling to fulfill this need. Categories of his officials, the yuktas, the rajokas, the pradeshakas, and so on, were to do public readings of his edicts, where he explains what he means by the ethics of governance. And they were to make tours across their administrative domain and familiarize people with this teaching and this ethic. This is not conversion to Buddhism. This is something much, much bigger and concerns the whole of society. How you live well, you govern well, what are your rights and demands, what do you expect, and how can it be fulfilled? And then the officers have to report their findings back to the king. And through this activity, they are inculcating the ethic of virtuous behavior on the part of everyone, including the rulers and the ruled. It's not just one category of people that have to have ethical behavior, but all. Ashoka did not succeed, of course. He left us a legacy of the idea, which I think is terribly important, to be followed, to be discussed, maybe to be continued if possible. And he told us what we could aspire to, which is equally important. Let me end then with a question that I've been asking myself and I have no answer to. So when we hold up model heroes from history, why do we always give so much space to the largely battle-scarred, violent conquerors? Why is Ashoka not mentioned as being different? And what is the difference? And this is why I was so thrilled with Rajiv's discussion of him. And the question I keep asking is that can it be that because he called for the linking of governance with ethics, people are quiet about him?